Hi there, and welcome to the podcast. I am your host, John Ivison, and I'm delighted to say that I am joined by my post-media Ottawa Bureau colleagues, Ryan Tumilty and Chris Nardi. Good to see you both. You don't send flowers, you don't write. I consigned you to the Siberian salt mines of the Public Order Emergency Commission, which is looking into the government's use of the Federal Emergencies Act to end the Freedom Convoy protest last February, and since then we've hardly seen you. So good to see you both.
Great.
Good to see you too.
So I thought it would be useful to bring folks up to speed on what has happened since October 13th. I mean, obviously there are days when the inquiry has really hit the news, and then there have been other quieter days. I don't suspect many people have followed a blow-by-blow account of what's happened. So we're almost at the end of hearing from witnesses. We're in the penultimate week this week. Next week is going to be a big week because we're going to hear from the Prime Minister and ministers who are basically going to say, here's the case for the defence. Because it does seem to me that thus far it has not been going very well for the government. But I want to get your impressions because you've been sitting there watching it. So let's start with broad brushstrokes, and then we can drill down a little bit deeper if I can mangle two metaphors at once. So Ryan, what have you taken away from the hours and hours of testimony that you've seen?
Well, I think, you sort of hit the nail on the head there, because next week we're going to see the Prime Minister, we're going to see the Cabinet, the people who actually made this decision justify it. And right now, I don't know that the evidence is piling up in their favor. We've heard from RCMP officials, we've heard from police, we've gotten hints of what CSIS is going to say when they testify, that there really wasn't a clear national emergency that justified using this act. And, the Emergencies Act isn't something to be used lightly. It's not something that's supposed to be there to clear out a normal protest. We've also, of course, heard that this wasn't a normal protest, but still we're not getting that clear case that there was a justification for this.
Chris, same question. What's your impression? And I guess, more importantly, what do you think Justice Paul Rouleau's impressions have been so far?
Well, I do get the sense that Commissioner Rouleau will have a long series of recommendations that he'll be making, because that is part of his mandate too, right? It's not only to determine if the Emergencies Act was invoked or met the threshold basically for invocation back at the Freedom Convoy days, but what can be done to avoid that exact situation in the future. And I do get the sense that as much as it will be interesting to see if he rules that the Trudeau government had, let's say, met the legal threshold. It'll be even more interesting, I think, to see what he recommends to address this one thing that we've noticed throughout, and it's the incredible dysfunction, quite frankly, between Ottawa Police, the Ottawa City Council, and all these just levels of government that weren't talking to each other, weren't communicating. In Ontario, that politicians weren't able to even kind of nudge police, and when they did try to nudge them, they did it very poorly. We did hear Ford talking about being up police's derriere with a wire brush. So there's just kind of this whole structure of dysfunction at many levels, not everywhere, but in the important places that needed to deal with the convoy, most notably the Ottawa Police Service, obviously, and then Ottawa City Council and the Ottawa Police Board, which is basically the direct oversight to police. So I agree with Ryan that the litmus test right now certainly hasn't met when it comes to indicating, or proving that the Emergencies Act was absolutely vital or dealt with a national security threat. As defined by the law. But in this particular case, what we are seeing is incredible insight into how government works, and sometimes just really doesn't work. And it does make you worry what would happen if there was a real emergency. So Ryan, I was thinking yesterday, you mentioned the Emergencies Act is not to be used lightly. I suspect there are one or two ministers and senior staffers who are now regretting the fact that it was used at all, because we're getting to see behind the kimono right now. I mean, that in itself, I guess, might deter future use, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm getting to read Marco Mendicino's text messages. I'm getting to read Bill Blair's text messages. Under normal circumstances, they go to great lengths to make sure that never happens. And we're getting to see...
Right, I mean, they're not accessible, right? You can't get them through access to information. This is a pretty unique view of them.
Yeah, and I guess my only thinking on this is that as much as I'm sure they did not want this access, they had to have known that was going to happen when they invoke the Act. The Act doesn't make this commission, voluntary. This commission is an absolute requirement of the Act. And they chose to waive cabinet confidence. They could have fought it. And we are seeing that, sometimes you hear that a government has waived cabinet confidence and they've really only let a little bit out. I think they've let pretty much everything out. We're not seeing a lot of redactions. We're not seeing a lot of things not being delivered. And certainly there's been a lot of paperwork, a lot of documents that make it clear that the government doesn't have that strong a case here, and yet they're all in the hands of the commission now.
So let's look back at some of the testimony. We had senior officials from the City of Ottawa and senior Ottawa Police Service officers, including former Police Chief Peter Sloley, who described the chaos that unfolded in late January with hot tubs and bouncy castles, etc., etc. Chris, was there anything said by Sloley and others that vindicates what appears to have been a complete collapse of civic authority in the nation's capital?
Vindicates? Ooh, you'd have to search really deep for that. I don't even know what part could be vindicated. I mean, it was so.
Well, they said it was an unprecedented event, which caught everybody.
Which I agree, it was unprecedented, both in maybe in the intent that the Freedom Convoy organizers had when they got here, but it really became unprecedented because they let them become entrenched in the streets of Ottawa on day one, right? And they allowed hundreds of vehicles to park all over the streets in and around Parliament. And because of that, it became unprecedented. Of course, we've never really, done that with protesters who, you can just go back and read the media coverage back in the day, had clearly telegraphed that they were staying. Like they were not, it still surprises me that police were surprised, or some levels of police, not all, and that's important because we'll come back to that. But that Ottawa police were surprised that these organizers and these protesters only planned on staying one weekend when they had telegraphed all along the road coming in from BC that they planned on staying until COVID-19 mandates and all sorts of other laws gone.
I was looking at the testimony from the protesters. Nobody seemed to be more surprised that they were allowed to drive onto Parliament Hill and Park than they were.
It's true, though, because one of the key organizers, one of the first ones, Chris Barber, again, you kind of have to take these testimonies with a grain of salt because there's a lot of, hindsight is 2020 and they're allowed to, it's all intent, right? And you can't really prove intent unless it's written down in a document. But, he himself said that he expected to have to park on a parkway here in Ottawa. It's called the Sir John A. Macdonald Parkway, which is further away from Parliament, and then walk to Parliament for the protest, and was surprised himself to discover that the police were actually ushering the vehicles to Wellington Street, which is right in front of Parliament. And so he was like, okay, went ahead, and the people that he was convoying in, leading in, parked on Wellington, and that was the end of it. They just stayed and could stay, and for 3 weeks. So absolutely, the way that the police prepared for this was for a traffic event. They made that very clear. The whole plan for that first weekend was just dealing with traffic. And obviously, even Peter Sloley, former police chief Peter Sloley, said it took him basically an hour or two on the Saturday of the protest to realize, oh, I might have messed up. These people are not leaving, and just, within that same day almost, he was starting to call it an occupation. Actually, just a few days later, documents show they started calling it an occupation.
So, Ryan, we had succession of convoy leaders appearing, and they didn't come across as the well-organised insurrectionists that various government ministers, from Marco Mendicini to Bill Blair, would have had us believe at the time.
No, absolutely not. They consistently admit that they had no control over this protest, which was their own protest. There were different camps and different factions. A lot of the testimony from convoy organizers seemed to be about settling scores between convoy organizers about who had really made the mistakes here and who was really leading the movement. These people were not well organized. I think they had a plan to stay, but I don't think they had a plan to manage a protest or an occupation, whatever you want to call it, of this size. It was very clear. And, that comes out, too, in conversations with police and there, that they didn't know who to negotiate with. And when they negotiated with, they couldn't get any, agreement that an agreement would be followed by everyone else. They didn't lead this movement in the way that other groups might have. Anything that they might have agreed to with the police or with politicians, there was no guarantee it would have been followed.
So we get to February 14th. The government gives itself these unprecedented new powers. Ironic, given that the protest was against government giving itself unprecedented new powers. In her pre-hearing testimony, RCMP Commissioner Brenda Lucki was not convinced there was a need for the act, that existing tools could still be used. CSIS boss David Vigneault, this is again in a pre-hearing testimony, because I think we're still to hear from him, he said when he learned the government was considering the act, he felt obliged to clearly convey the agency's view that there did not exist a threat to the security of Canada. Now, I realise that Cabinet is the ultimate arbiter of what is not a threat to national security. But those are pretty compelling testimonies, Chris, no?
Well, pretty compelling, especially that you have to tell yourself that, you have to ask yourself, rather, who is better placed to determine what is a threat to national security? Cabinet, which, of course, actually ultimately holds that power and is the ultimate arbiter, but is not trained in national security issues, or one of Canada's top national security agencies, who basically looked at this. So how it works is that the Emergencies Act, the way that it was invoked in February, what it was responding to was a national security threat as defined in what we call Section 2 of the CSIS Act, CSIS being the spy agency. And so when it was created, part of that agency, the act that created that agency, defined a national security threat rather clearly. And it kind of also thus defined the threshold that it would require to meet the definition of a national security threat. And the Emergencies Act refers to that definition specifically when it says, well, this act can be used to respond to a national security threat. And so what we saw, we haven't heard him say it, in person yet, but what he's told the commission, David Vigneault, head of CSIS, is that they never found a threat that met Section 2 of the CSIS Act. And that's their job. I mean, he admits it, it's not ultimately our responsibility to define every Section 2 CSIS Act, but we feel compelled to tell you, Cabinet, on February 13th, that we have not found this threat that you are looking to address basically tomorrow, that it was the next day that they would invoke the Emergencies Act. But, Cabinet is the one who decides. They may have determined elsewise. Maybe they received information from another agency that we still haven't heard yet. There's less and less time for us to hear that. But ultimately, I think that will come down a little bit to the court of public opinion, who is better positioned to define what a Section 2 CSIS Act national threat is. So which leads neatly, Ryan, to testimony which we think we're going to hear today, Thursday, from Jodie Thomas, who is the National Security Advisor. Now, at the time, she seemed to be seeking a justification for invoking the Act. In her notes to colleagues, she asked the Privy Council Office for an assessment, and she seemed to want to lead them to the conclusion that the convoy was a threat to democracy and the rule of law by people, and this is her quote, who are preparing to be violent. It smacked of the similar desperation to me that Marco Mendicini and Bill Blair were seeming to solicit support for use of the Act from other stakeholders. From Brenda Lucki mentioned this in her notes to colleagues, and the Mayor of Windsor mentioned it as well. So there did seem to be a sense in government, well, we don't really have the justification, but we're going to find it somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Jodie Thomas. We know Jodie Thomas sort of reached into the RCMP, past the commissioner to the head of the intelligence section there, asking for a very quick assessment of the dangers of the convoy. I think they were definitely looking to shore up their case. I'll be interested to see this week, once we start to hear from cabinet ministers, people who were at this table, as to how they justified it, because they had to get everybody around this issue. They couldn't just have the prime minister decide it and lead by will. Everyone else had to sign off on this too.
So we're now looking ahead to what we expect to hear from Trudeau and his ministers. Chris, I have talked to some ministers, and they keep referring to what is essentially Section 6 of the Emergencies Act, which says invocation could be justified if the government believes on reasonable grounds that a public welfare emergency exists. It seems to be a hope that the Commissioner will take a flexible view of the Act and not be quite as prescriptive as the description you just gave of the CSIS Act. Do you think that is it's a lifeline that is in any way likely, or is it a Hail Mary?
I mean, it's the first time this act was used, right? So this whole commission, which was set up, as Ryan was saying earlier, by law, it's kind of also an unprecedented work that it's doing, where I think it'll actually kind of set the tone for, well, hopefully never, but, you know, if there are future uses of the act, it will kind of set the tone for how that, you know, its use is assessed in the future, and the threshold is assessed. So I don't necessarily have the answer to that question. I don't know. Rouleau hasn't actually very much telegraphed where he seems to be leaning in terms of utility or not of the act. We have heard from a plethora of individuals, police, and even, you know, non-federal politicians, that the Emergencies Act tools, ultimately, they didn't really use. Where it seems to have had the greatest utilities, in some cases, to compel tow trucks, or at least to make sure that tow truck companies were available to clear out protesters. And we may hear, you know, this week or maybe next week about the financial aspect, the freezing of bank accounts that was used against convoy organizers and supporters, and that basically cut off their financial lifeline. But, you know, to answer your question, will they meet that definition? I don't know. But the one aspect that we haven't, again, you know, we've explored a little bit as of Wednesday, but haven't heard of a ton, I think the ministers will bring up a lot, is the economic aspect of these protests, the kind of the standstill that they feel the Ambassador Bridge blockades and the border blockades brought us to, is kind of like the non-police, non-safety aspect will definitely be part of the calculation that the cabinet made when they invoked the Emergencies Act. They might have just been looking at the situation and said, this is costing us so much money, and we're getting so much pressure from our American counterparts to reopen this border that we just need to do anything we can to end this.
Right. Okay, we're running out of time here, but final question for both of you. Given the fact that the NDP has already given the Liberal government a free pass on this, do you think there will be any downside for the government politically? Ryan?
I mean, Abacus Data did a poll not long after, I think about the first 2 weeks, that said, I think it was about 60% of Canadians felt that regardless of what the commission turns out, you know, there was chaos on the ground and the government was right to use it. And I think we may be forgetting sort of, as much as, yes, we're talking about legal definitions and standards that should be respected in the Emergencies Act, I think a lot of Canadians were looking around and being like, this has to end. Ottawa has to get back to normal. You know, in the case of the Ambassador Bridge, it reached the point where auto workers were cutting shifts and laying off workers temporarily because they didn't have parts to build cars. You know, I think
although that protest was cleared before the Emergencies Act was invoked.
It was, but there was concerns that it would come back. And I think there's a certain degree that the government may get a certain degree of latitude there from people who, you know, let's be honest, most Canadians did not support the trucker convoy's aims. Most Canadians got vaccinated and supported vaccine passports. So it will be interesting to see how that turns out. And yeah, Jagmeet Singh has said he's not going to bring down the government about this. So it may be a distant memory by the time we actually go to the polls.
Sure. Chris?
Well, ultimately, I totally agree with Ryan. And I think that a lot of people's views on the invocation of the Emergencies Act are already made. You either supported it at the time or you didn't. And I don't suspect that this commission nor the result of it will ultimately change a lot of people's minds. And if most people already supported the use, well, then they'll, you know, if he says, well, it didn't meet the legal threshold, the fact of the matter is that the people whose lives it impacted, mostly convoy protesters, it impacted very strongly, but that's a very small number of people. And the amount of people it did not impact, well, the vast majority of people, will ultimately maybe see government overreach and be, you know, frustrated or flustered by that, and be happy that maybe Rouleau may, you know, come down on the government for it. But ultimately, you know, it's not going to solve the cost of living, affordability crisis. It's not going to, you know, housing shortages. There are more pressing issues ultimately on people's minds. And I do think that when the report comes out, likely in February, people may have moved on. But again, I'm going to circle back to the recommendations that Rouleau has to make. I think those will be a lot more impactful, especially if the government actually takes them, and listens to them. The recommendations will be a very interesting pathway, and hopefully avoiding the utter chaos that happened during the Freedom Convoy in February.
Great. Well, listen, thank you very much for your service, guys. We'll see you when the commission is over. The editor has authorised me to buy a bottle of supermarket sparkling wine to share between the bureaus, so we'll celebrate Christmas in style.
Great.
Look forward to it. Thanks, John.
See ya.